LDR or low dynamic range. This means that we don't lose detail in over or underexposed areas, but we still have to define how all of this color data maps to the much lower range on our display. This is done with a post-processing effect called tone mapping. So you can see the visual appearance of our scene has already changed quite a bit. But the very big difference between a default scene in Unreal and one in Unity is post-processing. Because by default, Unreal applies a lot of post-processing effects. To get these in Unity, we go Window, Asset Store. Here we'll search for the post-processing stack. This is a series of post-processing effects made by Unity themselves. Let's hit download and import. I'll of course have a link for this in the description. Let's hit import again. You should now see a post-processing folder appear in your project panel. We can then select our main camera, hit add component and search for post-processing, and here we'll select the post-processing behavior. This takes in a profile. To create a profile, we'll right click in the project, go create, post-processing profile, and we'll just call this CC for color correction. We then select our main camera and drag that in. Now if we select our CC profile, you can see all of the different effects that we now have available to us. The first one we want to enable is color grading. Under here we have the possibility of adjusting our tone mapper. Tone mapping is where we decide how our HDR color data will be displayed on screen. In Unity we can either configure this ourselves or use a preset provided to us called Filmic. This uses the ACES Filmic tone mapping curve, which is also the default tone mapping curve in Unreal Engine 4. If you want to learn more about the math behind this curve, I will have a link in the description. And by default we can choose from two profiles. Neutral, where we can adjust everything ourselves, or Filmic. And you can see right away our scene just pops so much more. Next we can enable eye adaptation. While playing this will mimic the effect of your eye adjusting to a certain brightness level by automatically changing the exposure of the camera based on the brightness of the scene. After enabling the tone mapper and eye adaptation, you often have to go in and adjust some of your brightness levels. I'm gonna go to lighting and bump up the ambient light to 2, as well as select my directional light and change the intensity from 4 to 7. Let's then go back to our post-processing, and the rest of the effects are fairly small changes. We of course want to add in some motion blur. You can control how much motion blur you want using this slider. The bigger the number, the more the motion blur. Unreal also includes a vignette by default. Let's enable this and maybe bump down the intensity a bit. If you don't have the possibility of baking your lighting, you'll often also see ambient occlusion applied as a post-processing effect. Let's enable it, and you can see the shadowing that now gets applied to objects that are close to each other. We can of course adjust stuff like the radius and the intensity. We can also add in a bit of bloom. Now I want this effect to be very subtle. I'll bump down the radius a bit and the intensity as well. Finally, we can get rid of these ragged edges by applying anti-aliasing. By default, this is going to use a fairly light technique called fast approximate anti-aliasing. Let's just scale up our game view here and hit play so you can see how that looks. Now this definitely gets rid of the ragged edges, but you will see a lot of flickering on the screen. This is something that I often see people complaining about in Unity. But now with the new post-processing stack, we have the possibility to fix this the same way that Unreal does, by using another method called temporal anti-aliasing. You can see this gets rid of almost all of the jitter and makes the movement of the camera feel so much more smooth. And one thing that I also want to do real quick is go to color grading and bump up the post exposure a bit. That definitely looks a lot better. If you want to learn more about post processing, I have a dedicated video on the subject. Now that's about all the quick to apply graphics settings I can think of. There are of course a million